So I don't know about you, but I've never had a cheesesteak outside of Philly that's quite like the real thing. But why is that? I mean, it's just cheese and steak on a roll. How hard can it really be to replicate? A lot of people say the secret is in the roll itself, but as I found out, the steak is not quite as straightforward as it seems either. Now, I have found for sure that using thinly sliced beef is absolutely essential. I also found though that I prefer a leaner cut of beef, or at least that's what I thought I preferred. You see, the problem with that was that when I compared the different cuts of beef, the leanest cut was also the one that was sliced the thinnest, which may have skewed the results. But fortunately though, I found another method that allows me to slice any type of meat to the perfect thinness. Wow, yeah, that works really well. But as a lot of comments pointed out, I really should have retested all of those cuts of beef using the mandolin method to figure out once and for all the best cut of beef for a cheesesteak, which is exactly what I'm gonna do in this video. But first, I have another problem to solve. See, in the last episode, I was trying to get a pretty hard sear on the beef because common cooking knowledge would tell us that that's gonna lead to better flavor. But there is one problem with that. As some commenters pointed out, cooking the meat at a higher temperature is gonna lead it to dry out a little bit quicker. And in fact, most places in Philly do cook the meat pretty gently. I figured it wasn't really by design. I thought it was just because they're cooking in such large batches. But there may actually be a better reason for that, so I had to give it a try for myself. Wow, so that's actually a lot more noticeable than I thought it would be. And basically the results are exactly what you might expect. The one that I seared pretty hard at first definitely had the best flavor, but it also had sort of a dry, rubbery texture to it. I tried the best I could to turn down the heat after I got the sear, but I think this meat is just so thin that it's pretty hard to overcook it at that point. So the one that I cooked gently the whole time was super nice and tender, but it almost had no flavor to it. I think if you are gonna cook it super gently, you need to use a fattier cut of beef like ribeye, and so I can definitely see why a lot of places do that. However, I actually had another option that easily beat both of these, and I think it actually works really well with the leaner cut like this one. And it's actually a method I discovered by accident. During my earlier testing, one time I just forgot to take the meat out of the freezer, and so I had to cook it straight from frozen. I had the heat super high just like I did with this one, and so it got a really nice sear on the first side, but then it didn't overcook on the inside because it was still frozen in the middle. So that solves that, but I still have one more thing to figure out. Because there are a lot of moving parts to this cooking process, and if I've learned anything from my New York style pizza series, it's that it doesn't really make sense to try to figure it out from scratch. I mean, if I'm trying to replicate these places that already exist, I might as well just learn exactly how they do it. And for that, I'm gonna turn to YouTube. And I've actually been able to find 5 videos that seem like they're gonna be pretty helpful. A few of them show some of the best restaurants that I visited when I went to Philly. So we've got Angelo's, John's Roast Pork, and D'Alessandro's. And then we've also got Jim's Steaks, which unfortunately I wasn't able to visit because they're currently closed due to a fire. But they're one of the other most iconic spots in Philly. And then we've also got a video from the owner of Tony Luke's, which again I didn't visit, but he's got some pretty good insights here as well. But regardless of which place we're talking about, it all starts with the onions. Now most places seem to prep the onions in advance and then just push them to the side of the griddle or keep them in a container until they're ready to add to the sandwich. Now I do remember when I went to Angelo's, I thought their onions were cooked perfectly, and we can see here that they're just lightly sweated, not too much browning on them, but cooked enough to sort of bring out their natural sweetness. So for me, I'll just add a little bit of neutral oil along with some salt and cook them over very low heat until translucent. Then I'll cut the heat and push them to the side until I'm ready to use them. Still, the big question though is how do we cook the steaks? And actually everyone kind of seems to have their own method. For example, at D'Alessandro's, they don't start with any oil on the griddle, and I've already talked about earlier in this series, they don't season the meat at all either. However, I think that works for them because they're using ribeye, which has quite a bit of fat of its own, so you don't really need to add extra fat. But for these places like John's Roast Pork, and even Jim's here, they use a slightly leaner cut of meat, and so I think they do need to add that oil on the griddle in order to have it cook properly. I think that's actually how they're able to get a little bit of browning and flavor, even though they're cooking at a relatively low heat. And it looks like they're all just using a neutral oil. I've seen other people online mention using beef fat for the griddle, but I think if you're using a relatively fatty cut of meat, that's probably not necessary, and it's not what the places in Philly seem to be doing anyways. Now unfortunately, I'm not actually sure what cut Angelo's uses. It looks more like sirloin if I had to guess. It's pretty lean, so that explains why they're adding so much oil on the griddle. But another thing I found super interesting was what Tony Luke said here.
You know, I think the secret to a Tony Luke's cheesesteak is that we cook it on a very low temperature. What I like to do is slowly cook the ribeye to get all the juices out of it. If you cook it on too high of a temperature, you kind of put a crust on it. Now, for a thick steak, that's good, but for a thinly sliced ribeye, you want it low and slow is much better.
So it's interesting to hear him talk about the difference between cooking a full-size steak versus this thinly sliced beef. It's a completely different thing, and so that's kind of where I went wrong before, because I assumed that what makes a good steak good would also make this cheesesteak meat good, but that's definitely not always the case. And again, I think they can get away with that because they are using a piece of meat that has a little bit more fat, and it still sort of fries up and gets that nice browning on there. Now, I do still like to start with my meat a little bit frozen because I find that it just helps to further prevent it from overcooking. So I'll start at a moderately high heat and then quickly turn it down to get that kind of low and slow effect that he's talking about here. And on that note, it's also interesting to hear what he says about the salt.
I don't even salt this steak until it's done. And the reason we don't salt it is that salt will extract moisture from meat and you wind up with a very dry piece of steak.
But as I mentioned in previous videos, what I've actually been doing is salting the meat in advance because it gives it time to reabsorb that moisture, and so you don't end up drying the meat out when you cook it. If you don't have time to do that though, it does seem like using Tony Luke's method of just seasoning the meat toward the end of the cooking process is probably the best way to do it. But now, let's see how they chop the meat. So both Angelo's and John's Roast Pork use a pretty similar method, and when I tried the sandwiches, I did really like the consistency that their meat had. So I think that's the method I'm gonna use, and it's essentially what I've already been doing. Now obviously all of these spots are using a large flat top griddle, and I think having that extra space really does help when you're chopping up the meat. You can see just how much space that process takes up. And for me, I'm able to replicate that pretty well using my carbon steel griddle from this video sponsor, Made In. Made In designs professional quality products for the home cook. Their products are even used in multiple 3 Michelin star restaurants, and I understand why. This is the best cookware I've ever used, and I've tried some of the top brands out there. But what I like most about Made In's carbon steel griddle is its size. It covers 2 burners perfectly, and the rectangular shape is a super efficient use of space, so I can fit probably 3 or 4 times the amount of food on here that I could even in my biggest pan. So it saves me a ton of time for things like weekly meal prep where I'm searing a bunch of meat at once, or even for things as simple as heating up tortillas for tacos. I even use it to heat up leftovers. It works really well for crisping up New York style pizza, and it heats super quickly, so I can go from preheating to ready to eat in less than 5 minutes. But perhaps even more importantly for cheesesteaks, carbon steel is very responsive to changes in heat. So we can get that nice browning over medium heat at the beginning, and then turn it down to low to avoid overcooking the meat toward the end. But on top of all that, this griddle actually gets better over time. With just a quick re-seasoning after each time you cook, carbon steel gets more non-stick every time you use it. So if you want to pick up this carbon steel griddle or any of Made In's cookware, you can check it out via my link in the description below. Thanks again to Made In for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. But now, the cheese. So if you're just using slices of cheese like American, obviously you're gonna wanna let it sit on the griddle for a minute so that it can melt thoroughly, and you wanna kinda chop it in, make sure that it's fully melted before you add it to the sandwich. If you're using a cheese sauce though, like either Cheese Whiz or the provolone based sauce that I made in the last episode, there are a couple different methods. At places like Jim's, they just slather the bun with the whiz, then add the meat, and then add a little bit more whiz on top. Same thing at D'Alessandro's, but at Angelo's, they do it a little bit differently. They actually add the whiz on the griddle just like they would with the American cheese. And for me, I think that makes a huge difference. You really want that cheese to be fully integrated into the meat, and so that's exactly the method that I'm gonna use with my cheese sauce. Now here's another thing I don't actually see a lot of people mention, which is that some of these best places, before they fill the actual roll, they tear out a little bit of the interior of the roll. Because I could tell when I was eating at Angelo's and John's Roast Pork, they had a really nice ratio of meat to bread. I think if you don't do that, you end up with too bready of a sandwich. So for me, I'm definitely gonna do the same. Then we'll just scoop that all onto the roll until it feels like the right weight, I guess.
Feel the sandwich, you'll know how much meat to put in the sandwich. It's never going to be the same.
And then we'll wrap it. And wrapping it isn't just that you can take it to go. Most cheesesteak spots I've seen wrap the sandwich regardless of whether you ask for it to go or not. I think it's an essential step in achieving the authentic result. Because in addition to making the sandwich less messy and keeping it warm, both of which are important, it also allows the roll to steam a bit. I didn't realize how big of a difference it actually made until I gave it a try, but that extra little softness that you get from the steaming takes this from a pretty good sandwich into something that reminds me exactly of what I got in Philly. But now that we've got our cooking process dialed in, I think we can revisit our cuts of meat. And this time, I've got 5 different cuts that I'll be testing. First, our defending champion, beef knuckle, also known as sirloin tip, which I get from my local Asian grocery store. What I've been doing with it lately is slicing the whole thing lengthwise while it's still frozen into about 3 or 4 strips. That way I end up with these nice smaller slices that require less chopping on the griddle. Then next, I've got all of my mandolin cuts. Starting with the most classic choice for cheesesteaks, ribeye. On top of that, I got a New York strip for something sort of in between sirloin and ribeye in terms of leanness. And then I also got a dry aged New York strip, just because I figured why not. I've never actually tried a dry aged steak before, so I'm super curious to see if it's actually worth it. Then finally I got a chuck eye steak, which is a more affordable option to ribeye, but with a similar fat content. And this time I made these all into sandwiches using my provolone cheese sauce from the last episode, along with my Amoroso style roll prototypes. All right, so I've got all 5 of my sandwiches. They're labeled on the paper here, but I'm gonna try to keep them mixed up so that I don't know which is which. I think I have an idea what some of these are, and if I'm right, we're gonna have ourselves a new winner here. I do know for sure though which one I like the least, and it was this one here. Yeah, just as I thought, it's the chuck eye steak, and I could tell it had a noticeable stringy, tough texture to it. Definitely not as high quality of a steak cut as these other ones. It has a lot of fattiness to it, so I guess a decent flavor, but it's pretty hard to get past that texture. Now my second least favorite, which I'm actually pretty sure is the knuckle, is this one. Yep, so that's the knuckle that I've been using before. I could tell it was the leanest out of all these, which at first I thought I liked, but when the fattier cuts are cooked properly, they do actually work out pretty well. I think especially with my cheese sauce, which isn't quite as heavy as a straight cheese, you don't need to use quite as lean of a cut. Still a decent sandwich, and it's got a nice tenderness to it, but it's just a little bit drier than I would like. So that one's out. This one definitely tastes the best. It's got the most kind of beefy flavor to it. I don't really know how else to describe it. Maybe I could have seasoned these two a little bit more heavily, but as they stand right now, this one tastes the best. And it is the dry aged New York strip. So I had never tried a dry aged steak before, but maybe there is something to that. In terms of fattiness and tenderness, these all seem pretty similar. And honestly, with these other two, which obviously are the ribeye and the regular New York strip, I really couldn't tell the difference. I think they're all acceptable cuts when sliced properly. I guess if you really want to go all out and you don't mind spending a little bit more money, you might as well get a dry aged steak. But just for a classic cheesesteak, I guess ribeye probably is the best option. I think my problem with it before was number 1, it wasn't cut super evenly, but number 2, I probably overcooked it a little bit, so it just got dried out and kind of fried in its own fat. I think when cooked well, it's got just the right amount of fat, especially when paired with the cheese sauce like what I made with my provolone sauce, rather than the straight cheese. Speaking of which, if you want to learn how to make that sauce, you can check out this video right here. Otherwise, you can check out the next video in this series right here once it's uploaded. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.